Welcome and good morning, everyone here in Gießen and online to our colloquium on the perspectives on the rights of nature. My name is Franziska and I'm here from the panel on planetary thinking. The panel on planetary thinking, for those who don't know us, aims to understand what it means to be part of a planet. Planetary phenomena, crisis, and solution strategies are examined from a holistic as well as reflexive perspective in order to rethink and expand traditional sustainability research. Therefore, we try to ask the big questions. In terms of the past, how did planetary forces form us, and how did diverse societies acquire planetary forces that are capable of transforming Earth? In regards to the present, how can different societies deal with regular planetary changes that are beyond their influence? What does it mean to have planetary powers? How should they be deployed, and when should they be withheld? And prospectively, which planetary forces beyond our influence can we anticipate? Which planetary dynamics can we ally or reunite with? And which alliances should we quit if possible? To address these kinds of complex questions, the panel on planetary thinking was founded here at Gießen University in 2020 to contribute to a university-wide anchoring of planetary thinking. Our goal is to be an intellectual focal point and exploration space for the debate and consequences of an emerging planetary paradigm. Out of the various activities of the panel, I want to briefly highlight one of them, namely the Planetary Scholars and Artists in Residence program. The Planetary Scholars and Artists in Residence program provides the space for intensive collaborative work, how the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, life sciences, and arts grapple with the manifold relations between societies and the planet. And each semester, we invite at least one scientist and one artist to Gießen. And starting this afternoon at 2:15, we invite you to join us with the next hybrid event organized by our current fellow, Claudia Ford, Chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at the State University of New York, Potsdam, US, on Gaia and indigenous knowledge, starting with a James Lovelock Memorial Lecture here in seminar room 315 and also online, and followed up by a screening of a film, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change. But now let's start focusing on our main reason of our gathering this morning, namely the Planetary Colloquium Perspectives on the Rights of Nature. Our Planetary Colloquia, as you will see later on, aim to explore novel avenues, open and not closed debates, provoke and challenge the current state of thought towards a planetary way of thinking. And I think there could be no better composition of transdisciplinary speakers today and practitioners as we have here. Starting with a keynote lecture by Frank Adloff. He is professor for sociology, especially dynamics and regulation of economy and society, and director at Hamburg University of the Humanities Center for Advanced Studies, Futures of Sustainability. And just last year, he published a German book, Welche Rechte braucht die Natur? Wege aus dem Artensterben, Which Rights for Nature in English. After the keynote lecture by Doris Schweitzer from the University of Frankfurt, she is professor of sociology with a focus on sociological theory and history of theory. And she published also just last year an interesting article in Nature and Culture on the rights of things, a posthumanist approach to law. And we are very much looking forward to your contribution. We have, and now we are getting really interdisciplinary, Emily Alice Poppenborg Martin here from Gießen University. She is professor for animal ecology in the Institute of Animal Ecology and Special Zoology. And she, I think, brings in a very interesting broad perspective from the natural sciences on this issue. She published, for example, a highly cited article on the interplay of landscape composition and configuration, new pathways to manage functional biodiversity and ecosystem services across Europe in 2019. And now we're getting transdisciplinary with Franziska Johanna Albrecht from Green Legal Impact Germany, an NGO that describes itself as a catalytic strategic actor in the field of environmental law in Germany. The association, and I think she can explain this later better than I do, aims to strengthen access to justice in a progressively globalized world to help identifying the environmental impact of German actors abroad, governmental and corporate actions, and to strengthen global actors in their legal actions. She has a background in environmental and energy law and joined Green Legal Impact in April 2022. After we have half an hour of keynote lecture, we have each 15 minutes by the impulse lectures, and then we'll have at 11:30 a coffee break for 15 minutes, and after that a planetary discussion with all of you. And we also invite our digital participants to contribute to this discussion. And now, without any further ado, I would hand over to Frank.
Thank you so much, Frederick, for having me invited to this Planetary Colloquium. I'm looking forward to discussing with you the question of which rights does nature need? For many decades, scientists have been warning about our dangerous use of the biosphere. In 1992, Henry Kendall, a Nobel laureate in physics and co-founder of the Union of Concerned Scientists, issued a warning to humanity that was endorsed by 1,700 scientists. Humanity is on a collision course with nature. Of the many destructions of natural resources, especially the irreversible loss of species should be taken seriously. In 2017, Kendall's successors published the warning to humanity, a second notice, this time with more than 15,000 signatories. Since 1992, with the exception of the hole in the ozone layer, no problem has been solved. On the contrary, I quote, "Humanity has failed," says the team around the author, the ecologist William Ripple. It has not done enough to slow down catastrophic climate change, and what is more, it has unleashed a mass extinction, the sixth in roughly 540 billion years, that could wipe out many current life forms by the end of this century. In May 2019, the World Biodiversity Council, IPBES, released its first global report warning that 1 million species could become extinct in the next years. Political actors, in turn, have committed themselves at all levels to the conservation of biological diversity. In the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, member states commit themselves to protect biodiversity at all levels of genes, of species and ecosystems. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals also explicitly call for stopping the loss of biodiversity. Most recently, in the European Commission's biodiversity strategy, it is said the same. And Article 20 of the German Constitution protects the natural foundations of life, also in responsibility for future generations. But there are obvious shortcomings in the implementation of these objectives. Studies show that neither protected areas nor marine reserves have been able to protect biodiversity. Apart from a few individual successes, for example, with the crane or the white-tailed eagle, the decline of species continues without interruption in the vast majority of the world's countries. Could a new law, that is, rights of nature, help if all political measures have failed so far? That is the topic of my talk today. Before we address the rights of nature, let us first take a brief look at the dominant model that has been devised by economists and many biologists as a means of preserving biodiversity. Nature is increasingly viewed in terms of ecosystem services. After looking at this model, it becomes clearer what is special about the idea of the rights of nature. We will see that different notions of sustainability are also shaped by very different concepts of nature. Ecological modernizers view nature often very differently in comparison with advocates of a post-capitalist transformation, for example. Consequently, introducing aspects of ecological sustainability into political debates is not a singular process. Sociologist Fred Block once pointed out rightly, I quote, "There's not one, but several common ecological worlds." The notion that nature provides human societies with relevant ecosystem services is typical of the path of modernization. Since the late 1990s, ecosystem services have become a key concept in economics and environmental sciences. The starting point is the observation that human societies depend on certain functions of nature for their well-being. The necessary basic stocks of nature can be described as natural capital assets like clean air, water, metals, soils, etc. This capital yields returns, namely ecosystem services such as energy, plants, drinking water, and so on. Natural capital must be managed sustainably, as it is only available in limited quantities and should continue to yield returns in the future. It is said that ecosystems have a direct or indirect instrumental value to humans. Examples include forests, which cool the climate, store and clean fresh water, deliver construction timber and firewood, provide genetic diversity, and are recreational areas. Natural capital is valued for the services it provides. It is therefore a utilitarian and anthropocentric concept. Ecosystems do not have an intrinsic value, but an instrumental value for human well-being. The concept of value is thus used in accordance with economic theory. Benefits can be presented in monetary terms. Critics fear that the concept of ecosystem services will ultimately only accelerate the capitalist valorization of nature and will do nothing to counter the progressive exploitation of nature. On the other hand, practices of nature conservation, for example, establishing areas that are completely protected from human interference, are separating humans and nature. Nature seems to have an intrinsic value here. At the same time, the dichotomy between man and nature is reinforced. Edward Wilson's Half-Earth project, you see a picture of this project here, is a good example of a separation that does not aim at conviviality between humans and non-human actors. Processes of displacement of indigenous populations from their ancestral lands would rather be the consequence. I will continue by showing you an example of a rather different picture of how nature can be constructed by different practices of sustainability. In 2008, the Ecuadorian constitution was changed, including an article which anchors the rights of nature in the constitution. I quote, "Nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has a right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycle, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. All persons, communities, peoples, and nations can call upon public authorities to enforce the rights of nature." Unquote. Even though there are still conflicts and tensions in Ecuador regarding the real-world impact of the article, what this example shows is that nature is not just regarded as a resource to be protected, but attempts are made to escape an anthropocentric view, an anthropocentric model of sustainability. Biodiversity should not be protected solely based on human interests. The considerations that led to Article 71 of the Constitution have their starting point in the thesis that humans are not independent beings. People are not only dependent on other people, but also on physical, biochemical, and biological systems. The interrelationships with and dependencies on others are emphasized with the aim of allowing new collectives to grow out of them based on a new sense, one could say, of kinship, as Donna Haraway prominently put it. Civil society movements are currently striving for an ecologization of modernity in this sense, and there are close links to Latin American discourses and especially to indigenous cosmologies that do not follow the separation of nature and society. New hybrids of Western and indigenous thinking have been intensively discussed in Latin America in recent years, not only in Ecuador, but also in Bolivia or recently in Chile. The Latin American idea of rights of nature is a hybrid phenomenon, as the Western idea of rights, of human rights, is combined with indigenous ideas of nature. While in the Western model, nature cannot claim any rights of its own, in Ecuador, the cultural topos of Pachamama or Mother Nature, or Buen Vivir, which is of indigenous origin, has been used as a basis for the constitutional debates in recent years, in dialogue with international NGOs. Buen Vivir draws on indigenous knowledge, especially from the Andes, which is communitarian and non-capitalist in orientation and outlines a socio-ecological concept of development and the good life. The struggle for Pachamama should first be understood as a struggle for the traditional indigenous way of life. It is about the foundational and reciprocal relationship between people and their land. In other words, the indigenous groups were not concerned with the rights of nature for their own sake. The example of the Whanganui River in New Zealand, which became a legal person in 2017, also shows the inseparable interconnectedness of the Maori with the river. The legal personality of the river emerges from its interconnectedness with the identity of the Maori. The term rights of nature is thus equivocal. Indigenous peoples and NGOs sometimes mean different things. NGOs seek the protection of natural entities for their own sake, while indigenous ideas emphasize making no distinction between humans and nature. Following on from this, there's a current debate in the global north on whether and how the concept of nature as a legal entity should be further developed. Recently, more and more voices have been heard calling for a different approach to nature, primarily by granting natural entities a status of a legal entity. It seems basically possible to recognize natural entities such as a regional ecosystem as legal entities also in the German legal system. Thus, not only individuals, that is, for example, the individual pig or a cow, can be legally protected, but also collective entities, such as a species or habitats, such as a river delta, can also be granted legal status. Central to these Western ideas is the contribution of the US-American lawyer Christopher Stone, who decades ago, 50 years ago, developed the idea of a right of appeal for animals and natural entities such as rivers and ecosystems. I quote, "I'm quite seriously proposing that we give legal rights to forests, oceans, rivers, and so-called natural objects in the environment. As soon as things are given rights, they are personified and gradually appreciated in themselves, and not only for the benefits they bring to people. Since non-humans cannot speak for themselves in the same way as humans, non-human living beings and ecosystems would then have to be legally or politically represented. This is not surprising, since a multitude of things must be represented and spoken for, be it laws, companies, nation states, or God. Think of associations, corporations, or foundations that are legal persons. Stated directly, the law provides for the possibility of declaring a sum of capital, as in the case of a foundation, to be a legal entity and thus granting fundamental rights to capital. And this legal institution is not questioned by anyone. Already today, Officially recognized environmental and nature conservation associations can represent the interests of nature in court. This has been made possible by the so-called right of associations to sue, the Verbandsklage. But these possibilities are no more than tentative openings, writes Professor of Law Andreas Fischer-Lescano, because they are, quote, there are striking gaps in enforcement. Associations' actions are limited to the enforcement of simple law, and fundamental and human rights of animals and nature cannot be asserted through this mechanism. But that is exactly what species need in order to be able to claim their right to survival. Fischer-Lescano therefore proposes, I quote, the granting of autonomous rights to nature and animals, and thus the legal recognition of non-human legal entities. The Spanish Congress of Deputies recently has voted by overwhelming majority to give the green light to a popular legislative initiative assigning legal status to the Mar Menor, Europe's largest saltwater lagoon. This vote triggers the process to pass a law granting the lagoon its own rights, making it the first European ecosystem to be protected in this way. Granting animals or ecosystems the status of legal persons would have the goal of providing them with legal means that could take them out of the asymmetry vis-à-vis human natural persons on the one hand and legal persons on the other hand. Legal symmetry should enable them to make their own interests and points of view heard and enforceable under the aspects of fairness. This would involve a certain break with the anthropocentric foundations of Western social orders, and they would undergo a radical transformation. One would move towards more symmetry of human and non-human actors, and capitalist exploitation of nature could experience a stop rule. Such a symmetry has long been called for by Bruno Latour, for example. In his book Facing Gaia, he argues that defending Gaia, that is the Earth system, requires alliances with partial aspects of the Earth, with rainforests, the oceans, the species in the biodiversity hotspots, with the soils, and so on. Populations that depend on these components of the Earth system should ally with them and defend their subsistence against the disruptive and placeless forces of global capitalism. Since non-humans cannot speak for themselves in the same way as humans, non-human living beings and ecosystems would therefore need spokespersons. In this way, the environment would no longer exist, but would be internalized into a new collective. The French philosopher Michel Serres argued along similar lines early on. For him, there is a war against nature. A new nature contract must therefore be concluded with nature, with the aim of creating a state of conviviality, that is, reciprocity and symbiosis. Various objections are formulated against this. The standard justification for the preservation of biodiversity or ecosystems refers, as we have seen already, to concepts of instrumental values, such as ecosystem services. Other objections come from moral philosophy, which usually relies on a moral individualism, which is not necessarily only interested in the concerns of people in an anthropocentric way. Moral individualists also attribute moral intrinsic values to animals that are sentient and capable of acting. Non-sentient animals, on the other hand, are not granted this value. The individual chimpanzee and the individual pig are thus given a special moral and legal status, but not the individual snail, for example, or the collective of pigs as a species. The intrinsic value of an individual exceeds the interest in the survival of a certain species. In philosophy as a whole, this moral individualism has dominated in recent decades. Animals capable of feeling and acting have a moral value, but the rest of nature, it is said, the rest of nature is without moral or absolute value. It has no dignity, spoken with Kant. Compared to philosophy, to the discourse in philosophy, the legal debate has less need for justification with regard to the distinction anthropocentric versus biocentric. Just as a corporation is a legal person, and this does not require that it also possesses personhood in a strict realist sense, neither do animals, trees, or ecosystems require proof of possessing personhood, subjectivity, intentionality, intrinsic moral values, and so on. The aforementioned Christopher Stone points out that once entities are endowed with rights, they become personified and in this way gradually valued in their own right, not just because of the benefits they bring to people. The right creates a legal personification, which ultimately also brings with it the consequence of personalization in the everyday world. It is enough to consider the non-human beings methodologically as quasi-subjects. That is, we treat other living beings as if they had subjectivity, regardless of whether it can really be proven scientifically. This leads to recognizing non-human beings as quasi-subjects, to being able to relate to them in partnership or conviviality. Moreover, the distinction between anthropocentric, that is instrumental, and biocentric, that is intrinsic, values is short-sighted. There's a third realm, namely relational values. They are also anthropocentrically based, but they are non-instrumental. Relational values of nature are based on the fact that the good life can only be thought in relation to nature. Nature is not seen as an end in itself, but at the same time, the co-constitution of humans and nature is recognized. Nature is valued because it is a constitutive component of one's own individual and collective identity. This understanding of values is typical for many indigenous cosmologies, but also reflects the values of many people who are committed to nature conservation. The current IPES values assessment points out that that so far too much emphasis has been placed on the economic benefits of nature. Worldwide, more than 50 different methods can be found with which people determine the value of nature. Relational values are immensely important, and IPES has integrated them into its conceptual framework. Law is initially neutral to the question of whether an ecological person is attributed a relational value or an intrinsic value. The legal evolution of the personification of nature will show which of the people's concepts of non-human life will change and how the legal conception will develop. Jens Kersten, professor of public law in Munich, holds that nature as a legal subject should also be anchored in German constitutional law. He therefore proposes an amendment to the German constitution that recognizes the rights of nature, for example, with the following wording: the rights of nature are to be respected and protected. This does not imply that rights of nature can be set against principles of human dignity. The guarantee of human dignity is absolute and reserved for human beings, for example, in Article 1 of the German Constitution. According to Kersten, the instrument of subjective rights ensures dynamic and innovative legal development that is currently needed with regard to the multiple ecological crises. So he proposes ecological boundaries. The ecological common good, for example, could be laid down in Article 2 of the Constitution. Currently, it is written, everyone has a right to free expression of his or her personality, provided that it does not infringe the rights of others. One could say, as an amendment, that does not infringe the rights of others and the rights of nature. Furthermore, the social obligation of property should be supplemented, according to Kersten, to the ecological obligation of property in Article 14 of the Constitution. Or Article 19 of the German Constitution says basic rights also apply to domestic legal persons insofar as they are applicable to them by their nature And one could add here the creation of an ecological person. So basic rights apply to domestic legal persons and to ecological persons. Another proposal by Jens Kersten. Or he thinks of changing state organization law. For example, saying that the Federal Republic is not only a democratic social federal state, but it is a democratic social and ecological federal state. Let me draw some provisional conclusions. A number of civil society actors around the world are now campaigning for binding and enforceable nature rights. Whether an ecologization of societies can be achieved by means of rights of nature is currently still a largely unresolved question. The introduction of natural entities as legal entities may also lead to unintended effects. Critics say, if different legal positions compete with each other, social conflicts can be aggravated. Eventually, critics claim the human-nature dichotomy can even intensify when nature as a legal subject appears alongside human legal subjects. But is there an alternative to such an experiment with the possibilities of German law, of Western law? Humans need to get their place in the world right. In the midst of the sixth mass extinction in the history of the Earth, while the species around us are dying out at an unprecedented rate, this is more urgent than ever, not only for the protection of dying species, but also for our own survival, which will not be possible without functioning ecosystems in the web of life, of which we are part. But this new understanding of self and rights will not be reached easily, especially for the inhabitants of Western industrial societies. In Western thinking, anthropocentrism and an understanding of nature as a storehouse of resources have become entrenched over centuries. In my view, this strict separation of the spheres of nature and culture should be abolished, and, paradoxically, a means can be used that initially established and consolidated the separation, namely law. Law can recognize principles of interdependence and reciprocity. All those who contribute to the flourishing of a society should not be left empty-handed. The work of plants and animals is part of the social cooperation context and should be recognized as such. Law can, I would claim, contribute to overcoming the Western dichotomy between nature as an end in itself, that is a form of wilderness, for example, and nature as a utility flow of natural capital. An ecologization of the constitution and of law as a whole would make nature a member of the legal community and could lead to a more convivial interaction with nature. The German understanding of law is still far from such a recognition, but at least there's a slow paradigm shift underway to counteract the extinction of species through rights of nature for species or ecosystems. I thank you for your attention.
First of all, thank you very much for the paper you sent around, and especially for the talk today, which clarified some parts of the paper for me even more. And thank you for the invitation to give some now critical remarks. In fact, I will talk about the same examples as Frank Adloff did before. The thing, if I understood you right, you are exploring in the paper the space of possibility, I would say in German, the Möglichkeitsraum, opened up by the rights of nature. And in particular, you refer to the possibility of undermining the modern anthropocentrism of law, or of our thinking, in fact. For if I recognize nature as a legal subject, then it's a subject along the human subject, and no longer just a passive object of access that can be destroyed. As you said, a symmetric point of view. At the same time, the rights of nature become, so to speak, a bridge between indigenous worldviews and neuroscientific knowledge, in which similar movements are recognizable. Therefore, you developed in the paper, especially, you didn't talk about that much, as a form of a methodological animism, you wrote, that is, so to speak, a reflective attitude that we can develop with the, in respect of the rights of nature. You are talking about it as quasi-subject in the talk now. I completely agree with Frank Adloff. The rights of nature open up such a space of possibility, and we need to discuss about this space. Nevertheless, I would like to add a few critical remarks. For this space of possibility is not an abstract or an empty space. It's meanwhile preformed by the increase of the rights of nature as an empirical fact. I want to confront, so to speak, the options of thought with empirical examples. And therefore, I start with a few remarks on the empirical situation of the rights of nature. The term rights of nature refers to the phenomenon that on an empirical level, nature or certain natural objects or entities have increasingly been accorded subjectivity rights or rights of a subject since the mid-2000s. And this increase started in the community rights movement in the United States. And this movement was not referring to indigenous worldviews. A first overview of the existing rights of nature can be found on the website of the United Nations program Harmony with Nature. I gave you a screenshot here. You can see this is a phenomenon that can be found on different continents. There are now existing or pending national rights of nature legislations in over 50 countries in the world. In terms of structure, these rights are rights of defense. Nature is to be protected from violation and destruction. The rights of nature are the results of various legal instruments. For example, the Constitution of Ecuador, which has been mentioned. In New Zealand, the Wanganui River, which had been mentioned, it's a result of a bill, and more court rulings from all over the world. But there are also initiatives on the international political level, as the mentioned United Nations program Harmony with Nature, or the draft of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Nature from 2010. A number of political struggles are forming around the rights of nature. These struggles are about such heterogeneous topics as nature and climate protection, but also in the struggles for indigenous rights and community rights, post-colonialism or anti-capitalism. These rights form the point of reference for work of a numerous NGOs. We have one representation here. And you can see I just wrote down two central players in this field. In particular, strategic litigation attempts to expand the scope of these rights. As you can see, the space of possibility, it's not an empty space. There are a lot of different agents, different instruments, different interests, and so forth. But what we can see if we observe the debates about the rights of nature, what we can see as well, there's a specific political potential assigned to the rights of nature. And here we can note the convergence with the talk we heard just before. It is assumed that the rights of nature undermine the anthropocentrism of modern law. As Frank Adloff mentioned, this assumption does not concern the technical level of legal practices. From a dogmatic point of view, in both the common law and the continental law tradition, it is possible to construct rights of non-human entities. So to say, this is not a problem for the legal system. Just as a remark, there's also a discussion about giving rights to other non-human entities, as for example, to robots as an electronic person. The undermining of the anthropocentrism of modern law is seen on an epistemological level. And what I'm going to do now is, by referring to empirical cases, I will argue that the rights of nature do not necessarily push against the anthropocentrism of law. And I will talk about the two examples Frank Adloff chose as well, as the Wanganui River and the Constitution of Ecuador. which are widely discussed in the debates about the rights of nature, especially because they are referring to a holistic indigenous worldview. So I come to my first example, the Wanganui River. In 2017, the Wanganui River in New Zealand was granted its own legal persona as Te Awa Tupua by an act of government. This is the Te Awa Tupua Wanganui River Claims Settlement Act. And in Article 14 is written, Te Awa Tupua is a legal person and has all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. The act was a result of the struggles for collective rights of the river-settled Maori group of the Wanganui iwi. To declare the river itself as a legal entity is justified in the Government's Act in terms of the fact that the iwi do not define the relationship with the river in the terminology of Western ownership. The territory marked by the river is not the property of the iwi, rather they belong, so to say, to the river. They assume an intrinsic intertwining of humankind and nature, as expressed in Article 13c. You can read it here. I just quote the English translation. I am the river and the river is me. In the worldview of the iwi, they have duties and responsibilities toward the Wanganui River, which you can read in Article 13c as well. I quote, the iwi and hapu of the Wanganui River have an inalienable connection with and responsibility to Te Awa Tupua and its health and well-being. This means that the collective rights of the iwi concerning their territory or habitat cannot be expressed through the legal category of property, which degrades the river to a mere object of disposal. For this reason, the Wanganui River was given legal personhood as Te Awa Tupua, which is stated in Article 12, you can read it. I quote, Te Awa Tupua is an indivisible and living whole, comprising the Wanganui River from the mountains to the sea, incorporating all its physical and metaphysical elements. I want to make 2 points here. First, it's not the river per se that is being addressed, but its connection with the iwi. The Wanganui River is regarded as an environment for the iwi, as it is the relationship between the river basin and the iwi that receives recognition. Rights of a subject or subjectivity rights are not granted to the river or to nature for their own sake, but with respect to their intrinsic connection to the Maori. Second, the recognition of the legal personhood of the river seeks to protect human interests in this particular case, because the iwi's worldview does not fit into the categories of Western property. Other subjective rights were created to realize the Maori's historical claims with respect to the river. Above all, the Te Awa Tupua Act explicitly aims at the recognition of colonial injustice and an apology to the iwi, which you can read in Article 3A on the slide. Thus, the relationship between the Crown and the iwi is in the foreground. Ultimately, the granting of personal status to the Wanganui River in the present case still serves to regulate interpersonal relationships. In this respect, the recognition of the cosmological worldview of the Maori does not undermine the anthropocentrism of law, in my point of view. Even if we have the case that it's a hybrid, different worldviews now meet. So to say, in this case, the incorporation of indigenous worldviews on nature into non-indigenous legal systems turns into a protection of the milieu for human beings. In the end, this can also be seen as a form of recentering the anthropos. And I have to add, This recentering of the anthropos has the great advantage for the crown that it does not, the crown does not have to grant the Iwis real sovereignty for the territory, as it would be the case if they had given property to them. So I come to my second example, the Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008. I'm not going to quote it again because it has been quoted before. The famous Article 71 of the Ecuadorian Constitution. If you now look on court cases resulting from this regulation, we can also identify a danger by choosing the way of ascribing specific rights to nature. Frank Adloff mentioned it before, but on the sideways. For if nature becomes a legal subject alongside humans, it thus becomes accessible or evaluable in the legal sense. The coexistence of rights always leads to possible oppositions. The right of nature can now come into conflict with the right of humans. In the case of a conflict, we need a balancing, a weighing. In German, we say eine Abwägung. This is exactly what we can see in some court rulings from Ecuador, for example. Here, the priority of human interests in the destruction of parts of the Amazon for oil production purposes was established by judgment. There was a specific weighing, Abwägung of social concerns over the value of nature. Paradoxically, the rights of nature here lead precisely to an de-evaluation of nature. On the horizon then appears, in my opinion, a recentralization of man, now founded on the surplus value of the rights of humans over the legal subject of nature. The problems of hierarchization of humans in relation to nature is not automatically avoided. What I think the two examples illustrate is holistic perspectives on the rights of nature neither automatically or necessarily leads to an overcoming of anthropocentrism. We have to pay close attention to the consequences of existing rights of nature in order to discuss the space of possibility, which Frank Adloff opened up in the talk before. So, thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation today. I think the topic now will be somewhat different, but I hope that we can look for and see the direct connections that it does have to what's been discussed until now. So I gave this a pretty ambitious title, and perhaps it's, I guess, part of the discussions that we're having now, and let's see how much I can feed into that. So when I was asked to give this talk, the first thing that occurred to me was to wonder, well, the rights of nature, but what on earth do you mean by nature, actually? Because as an ecologist, which is my situation, I never call anything nature in my work, actually. It's a term that's too broad, too imprecise to use as a definition of some of the things that, most of the things that I'm working with in ecology. Of course, it's an important term, obviously, and has lots of implications for us as a society. But because of this, the first thing that I did was to look up the definition of nature in the dictionary. And what I found was what I suspected our understanding of nature to be already, but it actually reinforced this decision that I sort of have to not use this term necessarily, because if you look at the Oxford Languages Dictionary, nature is the phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. Definitely a clear separation there. If you look at the Cambridge Dictionary, all the animals, plants, rocks in the world, and all the features, forces, and processes that happen or exist independently of people, such as weather, sea, mountains, young animals or plants, and growth. Merriam-Webster is a lot more brief, but still has the same kind of meaning, the external world in its entirety. So implicitly, nature does not include humans in these definitions. So I actually don't think that in the usage of the term that we've had until now in the talks, I don't think that that's the case. I have the impression that nature is probably also considered more flexibly, let's say, but at least in the definitions that we have here in writing in these dictionaries, and probably for a lot of people in people's minds, people are something different from nature. And there are lots of examples of this dichotomy, actually. This is a journal that is literally called People and Nature, implying these are different things. People and nature, which is, I guess, also a point to discuss, but nevertheless, they are not the same thing. So, okay, here I was, and nature is apparently different from people, and I wondered, okay, is this true in terms of ecosystems, and from the perspective of ecology, at least? Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, there are a large number of ecosystems, one could say, that exist, have a functioning, have a long-term existence, let's say, independently of humans. This is the case, for example, of European beech forests. In some areas in Europe, pretty rare at this point, there are even undisturbed beech forests still. And this is an example of a temperate zone, actually, let's say, natural ecosystem that used to cover about 40% of Europe until 6,500 years ago and 2/3 of Germany. This is not the case now, as you know. But this is definitely, let's call it, if we want to use the term, a natural ecosystem. And worldwide, you can look at this all over the globe. There are going to be ecosystems all over the place that you find that you could possibly also call a natural ecosystem that exists independently or without the necessary presence of humans. And this goes from my pointer. This goes from nunataks in the polar ice caps all the way down to tundra ecosystems, to deserts in the Sahara and tropical rainforests, as we know. These are all systems that have an existence independently of humans, and we know this. All the way to marine ecosystems, of course, savannas, and so on. So this can be very broadly thought of. Such ecosystems do, of course, exist. So yes, we have ecosystems, we have species and processes that exist independently of people. So I'm not going to argue that. But on the other hand, it's pretty clear that these are strongly influenced by people, some more than others, some extremely so, some in more indirect ways, for example, through climate changes. And I'm going to describe a little bit here some of the drivers that we know. I mean, you've already developed that we have this mass extinction currently. These are drivers that we've heard about quite a bit. And these are actually things that we study directly in ecology. I'm not going to talk much about climate, but if we talk about things like, for example, deforestation, land use conversion, and land use intensification, these are very clearly strong drivers of the transformation of ecosystems by humans, right? So in this example, we have, let's call them wood areas. This is from the point of view of the production. You have crop areas where the land is used to produce crops. You have areas that are used to produce green fodder. And all of these areas go through a process of conversion on the one hand, transformation in terms of the structure, the species that are there, and in terms of intensification. For example, the usage of pesticides can be minimal, can be medium, can be quite high. It can be in terms of the intensity of things like grazing by herbivores. It can also be in terms of homogenization of a system from many species to one or a few species. And if you scale it up, what I'm showing here is basically at a more or less a plot level, one given area. But if you scale it up and think in terms of landscapes or even broad ecosystems, what you get from such transformations is things like habitat fragmentation of, let's say, large forest tracts into smaller tracts, which are less connected to each other, don't allow for the movement of species necessarily, or less so. You have homogenization of whole landscapes that instead of being heterogeneous and diverse, end up looking like only one type of habitat. You have also something that's called landscape simplification, and that's actually a main topic of what I work with, which I'm not going to talk about so much now. But what is landscape simplification? If you hadn't heard of this, it's pretty clear from the term, I guess, is that if you consider a whole landscape, let's say, I don't know, 1 to 2 to 3 or 5 kilometers wide at that kind of scale, and it can also be much larger if you think about a whole region. Then things like agriculture, intensive agriculture, the way we conventionally think of it nowadays in Europe, is going to have a tendency to have large fields, to remove habitats between fields, and you end up with gradients between landscapes that do have a fair number of habitats or fairly small structure of fields with margins between the fields, with various hedgerows and forest patches, contrasted to landscapes that are very large scale with basically an agricultural desert that do not have any other habitats in them than the crops. And these changes in landscapes, landscape simplification, we know that this leads to huge changes in the biodiversity of these landscapes. Of course, not only the plants, but also, for example, in the case of arthropods, which I focus on, very different impacts on different types of arthropods, the biodiversity of these species, which biodiversity of these species and how these different types of biodiversity are impacted. This varies. And this varies also depending on what parameter, what structural and parameters and composition parameters of the landscape you're looking at. But overall, these effects are huge. And this is a major driver of these extinctions, of course, that we were mentioning previously. So these changes of land use happen in different habitats. This is one example. We have loss of intact forest landscapes, which is obviously huge. We have all heard about it. And this study actually showed that in the course of 13 years, 7.2% of intact forest landscapes were removed from the globe. And in green, you have here the remaining intact forest landscapes. And in yellow, the forest zone outside forest landscapes. So I'm not saying this is not forest anymore. This is then secondary forest for the most part. Secondary or third version, and so on and so forth. So these are actually forest habitats that are still under anthropogenic influence as well. And this, for the most part, at least in many regions of the world, due to either logging or agricultural conversions. Another example here, what does it lead to, this intensification process in different types of habitats? Well, as you might expect, here's one example of the data that we have on this. It leads to the loss of species. And this study in particular is a global meta-analysis that brought together several hundreds of studies that actually looked at these gradients and looked at these effects. And it shows, as a grand mean, let's say, we have a circa 10% decrease in the species richness, so the number of species, through this process of intensification overall. We also have an increase in yields, by the way, because that's actually the trade-off in this case. And if you look at it in terms of species groups, this is also clear. There is a decrease, especially in areas with intensification of arable farming and areas with grasslands for green fodder. There, the losses of species are quite strong. So overall, we do have these impacts very clearly. There are many, many studies that look at this. These were just a few examples. And in some areas more than others, actually. And if you think of Europe, for example, I mean, in Europe, this has been happening for a long time, these conversions, obviously. We've been around for several thousands of years, if I'm not completely wrong. Of course, these impacts and the practice of agriculture, let's say, for example, which is a major driver, has been going on in several areas for a long, long time. Of course, the most recent trends are accelerated trends. So the climate trends recently include, and also trends of land use intensification recently are relatively much stronger than they have been over millennia. However, these millennia are also there. And they define the current ecosystems that we have, because we have influenced nature to the extent that whole ecosystems only exist with and because of humans. So what do I mean? The Mediterranean, for instance. In the Mediterranean, you have areas like the Maquis and the Garrigue. These are ecosystems which we cannot disentangle from the pristine or original ecosystem that would have been there without humans. We don't know what that is, really. The Mediterranean region has been colonized and, let's say, used for agriculture, has lived together with humans for so many millennia that at this point there's no distinguishing that. What we have recently is trends that are changing in this region, and basically over the millennia there has been especially grazing, there has been agriculture in terraces, and we have rather trends of abandonment of these lands for agriculture at the moment. And land abandonment is actually a thing. And it is also a driver for the loss of species. If you stop doing agriculture somewhere, you may also lose species. So this is a huge topic currently in the Mediterranean, but also in other areas with other agroecosystems. I'm using that term pointedly because it's not only ecosystems, but also agroecosystems in this case, that have been used for agriculture for centuries or even longer. And in these areas, there is the question of, well, maybe in this case, what we need is to maintain the farming system as it has been, in terms of, because this farming is high nature value farming and helps to support the species of this system and their functioning. So is farmland abandonment a good thing or a bad thing? Should we just kind of remove ourselves from these systems? Or should we keep doing something? And that there's actually a lot of money being invested into trying to incentivize or subsidize shepherds, for example, in Germany to maintain calcareous grasslands is one example, but also in systems where it's simply economically no longer profitable to have farming. Should we still try to maintain it? And this here is a meta-analysis or a global review of papers that have looked at the effects of land abandonment. Is it positive or negative for species in terms of their taxonomic diversity, but also other metrics of diversity? And in red is everywhere that you see a negative impact of land abandonment. So when you remove yourself from the land and you no longer practice agriculture in many cases or grazing, does this have a positive or negative impact on the species? And all this red that you see here was showing a negative impact of having abandoned these agricultural lands. So it's quite strong, with the caveat that it's when you consider the diversity pre-abandonment that this has negative effects. If you're mostly focused on the diversity post-abandonment or what was there before we did agriculture, then abandonment obviously has a more positive effect here in green. So it actually depends on which diversity you're trying to conserve. Are you interested in, the anthropogenically driven diversity of these naturalized ecosystems? Or are you interested in what happened before humans were there? So another point here is that this depends on the region. And very interestingly, Europe here and the old world more generally is very much biased towards thinking a change of our systems now is bad for diversity. If we stop doing agriculture, if we abandon these lands, then we lose diversity, because the reference point is the diversity that is there during the agriculture. But if you look in the New World, let's say, there, abandoning the land has a positive effect on diversity because it brings us back to what was there before humans. So it depends on your conservation focus. It depends what you're trying to restore or save. So, okay, overall, I guess my point here is that it's very difficult to distinguish nature is very difficult to distinguish from the activities and impact of people. You can't always do that. And even when you think you can, you probably can't if there were humans there before agriculture, such as indigenous peoples. So what is natural is actually often also anthropogenic, and actually making a dichotomy between the two I find extremely tricky. And then there's the question, okay, well, let's assume then that we're trying to talk about the rights of biodiversity or species or processes. That's maybe for me more clearly defined. Which one do we want to conserve? Which biodiversity? Are we talking about, let's say, the biodiversity pre-abandonment of farmland or post-abandonment of farmland? Are we talking about pre or post-anthropogenic impacts? Which anthropogenic impacts in the whole timeline of our existence? Some are maybe some we want, some we don't want, like, I don't know, pesticides. Are we talking about which species? The rare species or the common species, which we know will have a problem if we continue to proceed like we are? Are we talking about functional taxonomic diversity? So the diversity of species that has a use, a clear function in the ecosystem, versus just species in and of themselves, taxonomically separated or phylogenetically? Are we talking about invasive species? Do they have a right to exist and displace other species? Or are we trying to save endemics in different regions? How does that get defined or decided? Because, yeah, maybe we're thinking about the rights of nature as a whole, but nature is not one. And the same as there are conflicts between people and nature, I guess there are conflicts between species and within ecosystems. So are we also talking about individuals and populations? I mean, you're talking about the right of individual species, whether this should be a thing, but actually we could also be talking about multi-species communities, landscapes and ecosystems, and that's a very different thing, because if you talk about landscapes and ecosystems or whole communities, then you need to allow for the fact that in order for an ecosystem or a community to sustain itself, there has to be death and extinction at a smaller scale of some of the species and communities or populations within that ecosystem. So how do you allow for that if each of these have a right of their own? Okay, so it's quite a mess, I would say, and maybe one way to kind of get us out of this conundrum is to decide how and to whom are these things important. And I'm wrapping up, don't worry. One way to think about it, at least the way that I often consider in my own work, is the functional biodiversity. And here I'm talking about functional agrobiodiversity because I work mostly in agroecosystems. These are providers of ecosystem services. It's like you're mentioning, this is the concept that these species are somehow maybe important because they provide a certain service. And in this case, they provide a service to agriculture, natural pest control, pollination, which is important economically, which is one way to convince that it's important to keep them. But obviously, maybe we want to have these things anyway. I mean, maybe I don't necessarily care how much I pay for strawberries as long as I can get strawberries. So overall, we have data. Around 70% of crops require animal pollination, and natural enemies account for about 50 to 90% of pest control in crops, even when pesticides are being sprayed. So this is a huge contribution, I would say, that is direct and intrinsic to the production of food for us. So, okay, is this really the case? Are we just saying that? Well, we did a study where we tried to quantify whether this is really, whether we really need this diversity, let's say, for these functions. And we asked the question, does higher biodiversity really lead to more ecosystem services? And does it really lead to more crop yields, in our case, for instance? And this is, again, a global meta-analysis. Well, long story short, when we had higher pollinator diversity, we had higher pollination success. If we had higher natural enemy diversity, we had higher suppression of pest insects. And if we looked at yields, indeed, more pollination led to more production, and more pest control led to more production of agricultural yields. So yeah, long story short, we can say, yes, this does help. And since we can confirm that, we can also maybe think about an update here in terms of economic models, because the current agroeconomic models go from the idea that you have a certain land management. This leads you to agricultural production, right? And the more you manage this intensively, the more production you attain. Well, no, I would completely disagree. And these models do not take into account the fact that if you manage land in such a way as to destroy your biodiversity, then you are shooting yourself in the foot. And this biodiversity, because this biodiversity is also contributing positively to the agricultural production. So this means that the more input intensity you have, the more you would tend to have a decrease in your yields, because you reach a certain point where you are destroying the tools or the system that helps you to create these yields. So, to conclude, the 2 points I guess I'm making here is that it's not easy to distinguish nature from people or from what is anthropogenic. And as a result, and also because clearly we need these systems for our existence, but also these systems need us for their existence to some extent, the rights of biodiversity, at least functional biodiversity, it cannot be distinguished from the rights of people for stable health, shelter, and food security. There's no dichotomy that we can reasonably make there. So, and in addition to that, perhaps just as an extra argument, there is a precaution principle. We don't know everything, and as an ecologist, I know every day we know much less than we think we know. So if we want to think in terms of resilience, ecosystem resilience, we have to think in terms of redundancy and response diversity. So having more species that may have the same function is important, because if some of them go, then we might be able to fall back on others that we don't use, let's say, right now. And the same thing with response diversity. We need to have lots of species that are redundant and might play the same role, but also that respond differently to perturbations and disturbances. Right, so other species and the ones that are currently providing a service may also be important for functioning under future conditions. And with that, thank you very much.
The disciplinary perspectives in, so let's head over to the practitioner.
Hey, I see my presentation. Very good. Hello. I'm very happy to be here. I very much enjoyed your presentations, and I'm already looking forward to the discussion, because I think this is extremely interesting and I enjoy the interdisciplinary approach. I'm now going back from natural sciences to the law. In my daily work, I look at law in a practical context. I look at the laws that we already have, and if they are not working, which is unfortunately often the case, I look at how can we improve them. So to me, law is a tool. It's not this divine God-given system. It is something that we make, and if we don't like it, we change it. So I want to look at how the law is and how can we maybe cases. You may already know them. They are separated by about 30 years and about 10,000 kilometers in distance. One of them took place in Germany in 1988. It's the so-called Robbenklage or seals case. And that was the first time that a group of German environmental NGOs and their lawyers, obviously, tried to sue the federal government on behalf of the seals in the North Sea. So this was the first time that there was a non-human entity represented by lawyers in a court. And the issue at hand was that environmental pollutants were being dumped into the habitat of the seals, which was very bad for them. Their population was on the brink of collapse. Unfortunately, in 1988, the German court ruled that there wasn't even a court case because the seals lacked legal standing, and so did the lawyers and the NGOs. If you don't have legal standing, you can't bring your legal case. In 2018, there was another case. That was the Los Cedros case in Ecuador. We've already heard about the Ecuadorian constitution. And in this case, local government officials in Cotacachi, Ecuador, filed an action for injunctive relief against the Minister of the Environment and the general manager of a mining corporation. And they argued that administrative acts allowing mining in the Los Cedros protected forest violated the rights of nature of that forest. The case went all the way up to the Ecuadorian Constitutional Court because it was a constitutional issue. And the court ruled that the Ministry of the Environment had indeed violated the rights of nature. So 30 years, two different legal systems, similar subject matter, but two fundamentally different ways of looking at the problem, of addressing the issue. In our current legal system, individual rights are at the core, both in Germany and also in most other Western and Western-influenced legal systems. They are meant to safeguard a person's life, freedom, and property against both the state and other actors. And the law itself specifies who is a person. So, and you only get to have rights if you are a person. Under German law, humans are legal persons, obviously. So too are corporations and municipalities, for example. A university can also be a legal person. Seals are not legal persons, and neither are forests. And if you aren't a legal person, you don't have rights, you can't bring forth a court case. We do have other protections for nature. For example, we have the Federal Environment Protection Act in Germany. We have various other legal texts. They make a number of provisions for the protection of natural systems, species, and individual animals. But these protections are always passive. They do not create rights. They only create obligations for others, for example, for state actors or for private citizens. So it could be an obligation to protect the habitat of seals. And one argument that we often hear against the rights of nature is that if you grant nature rights, for example, the seals or forest, there would be an imbalance between between the rights and the obligations, because a seal cannot pay taxes, for example. Neither can a forest. And they cannot be held accountable if they hurt somebody. If a tree falls down and injures somebody, then we cannot hold the forest accountable for the tree falling. So it seems intuitively just that we don't grant rights of nature, since we have this imbalance between duties and rights. However, if we look closely, we find several examples where we have rights but not corresponding duties. For example, newborn babies. Newborn babies obviously have rights. Few people would argue against that, I hope. But we rightly demand very little in the way of duties of them. Similarly, we have non-human persons, corporations, for example. They do have rights and they also have duties, but these are not the same rights and duties that we accord to legal persons, because corporations and humans are different in many ways. And the law recognizes that. So the law has actually evolved mechanisms to treat like as like and unlike as unlike. So this argument doesn't really hold up. We also have a number of examples from other jurisdictions, from Ecuador, from New Zealand, from India. So this problem can be dealt with. Another issue would be, and this has already been addressed today in various forms, the distinction between individual and collective rights. At the moment, most of our current legal system revolves around individual rights, particularly individual rights centered on property. Granting individual animals rights from a technical point of perspective wouldn't be much of a problem under the law, and I'm sure my dog would appreciate it. It gets trickier when we are dealing with groups of animals, with a population, for example, or with entire ecosystems. How should we address the rights of a population, for example, of the seals in the North Sea? They are mobile, they can move around, they cross jurisdictions when they are hunting for fish. What do we do with migratory birds? We would need international agreements for that. And then how do we distinguish who is a member of a group and who is not? I mean, with large mammals, for example, wolves, may be quite easy to say who is a member of a certain population and who isn't. If you're looking at birds or insects, it quickly gets difficult. Or say we are looking at a biotope or an ecosystem. What is a forest? Is it the trees? Is it the network of physical, ecological relationships between trees and other plants and animals and bacteria and the soil and all the non-living components that make up an ecosystem? And where does the forest begin and another system, where another system end? Is it all part of a planet-wide system? Personally, I'm a huge fan of this idea of planet Earth as a living, breathing system, as a kind of superorganism, but it poses a serious legal challenge. Because systems thinking doesn't really mesh with our current legal system. So these are all arguments against granting nature rights. Then I brought you a law from Spain. This is the law granting the Mar Menor Lagoon the status of a legal person. It entered into force on the 3rd of October 2022, and lo and behold, it works. And they didn't even have to change their constitution. Now, we will have to see how it actually works in application, but from a technical point of perspective, as a lawyer, this is a law. It grants rights to an ecosystem. Looks good. It isn't obviously contrary to European or international law. Looking good, so it's possible. So we can integrate rights of nature into our legal system. And I would say that we also need to do it. We need to change our legal system because obviously it is failing to deal with the global crisis of both climate change and biodiversity loss. We need to change our system, but the progress of change will, I'm sorry to say, be neither linear nor quick, and there will be a lot of people who are against it because they stand to lose something. So what do we do? While we are fighting for a better legal system, we need an interim solution. We need a sort of stopgap because we are losing biodiversity at alarming rates, and this cannot go on. And unfortunately, we do not have the time to wait 10 or 15 or 13 years until people are ready to accept changes in the legal system and maybe a change of the constitution, as Professor Kersten proposed. Fortunately, we already have tools in our current legal system that we can use as a stopgap, as an interim solution. And I would argue that we need to use these tools. And until such time as we are able to perceive humans as a part of the biosphere and not as standing apart, we need to take responsibility as humans. We need to act as guardians of nature. And there's a tool for that. It is called the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation and Decision-Making and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters, which is extremely long. That's why people call it the Aarhus Convention, after the Danish city where it was agreed upon. And this convention has changed a lot in procedural European law. through its implementation in EU law and in national law. And it has led, importantly, to a broadening of access to justice for environmental NGOs. Now, I work for an environmental NGO, so I may be slightly biased. I am a huge fan of this convention. And Frank Adloff has already mentioned it. There are limits and flaws to this form of representative action, and they need to be addressed. And that's one of the things that we are working on. But it is a step towards a legal system that incorporates both public and non-human interests. And that's very important in my opinion, because we need this. We need guardians. And I think we need to expand and broaden the scope of access to justice, not only for NGOs, but also for individuals. Because under the current legal system, you as an individual cannot go to court and argue that environmental law is being violated. Only if you are a property owner and your property is being violated by somebody. So widening the scope of access to justice to encompass all environmental matters and decisions and removing financial and procedural hurdles to access to justice is absolutely necessary. Because used responsibly, this tool can help us help bridge the gap between aspirations of developing a better and more inclusive legal system and the current urgent need that we have to protect our living systems. That would be my suggestion for an interim solution. Thank you very much.
We should just start here in the room with the first collection of questions. I also have a couple of mine, but I would wait later. So, are there any questions? Lisa.
Okay, I'll just take the benefit of being the organizer and posing the first question. First of all, I'd thank all of you for these inspiring and enlightening talks. I really enjoyed having these different perspectives that already cleared so many questions that I had last evening when I was preparing for today. And I think it's particularly interesting that we have mentioned that Ms. Poppenborg has mentioned the limitations to the term nature and the nature construct, because that's what interested me a lot when I was trying to find a right title for our event. You might have you noticed that I put nature in quotation marks, and it seemed a little clumsy and in some moments, but still I couldn't bring myself to just write perspectives on the rights of nature, because I know, especially if we have people from different disciplines, it means so many different. I come from literary studies, and so of course I'm interested in how words and constructs shape the way we perceive ecosystems, we perceive nature, we perceive animals. And so what I was wondering was, there seems to be a tension that I noticed in all of our in your talks, between safeguarding individual rights and safeguarding rights of collectives or the health of ecosystems. And we've never really touched upon the question of ethics. And I think this is maybe interesting, because I'm not sure how productive it is to talk about ethics on ethical behavior, but I think these are so intricately intertwined in conceptions of law and for what we apply law and how law can be functionable in terms of safeguarding the health of the ecosystems. So maybe this question goes to all of you, maybe a little more to Ms. Poppenborg, but I think it touches upon all of the perspectives that how do you see the role of ethics and ethical behavior in connection to the rights of nature, whatever nature may be?
Thank you for the question. Also for bringing up this topic, because I completely agree that it kind of underlies our discussion. Actually, we want to give rights to something. And giving rights to something, or giving rights, actually feeling ourselves in a position to give rights, is a moral, ethical ground that we are. So, I don't know, how would we define the ethics of whether or not we should be? I think that's a very difficult question, because I was also mentioning briefly, and I agree with you, this conflict between the rights of the individual and the rights of the collective, or let's say the ecosystem, or the social ecological system.
Briefly, there is a, yeah, can you move closer to the microphone?
Okay, like this? Better, okay. So I find that impossible to answer for myself. I cannot decide, I cannot distinguish how to give a value to individuals versus collectives, because as an ecologist, I know perfectly well that, well, depending on the scale that you look at, the time scale or the spatial scale, the importance of different units of life varies, and but that they are all a component of the system. So you can't say, okay, all of these individuals must have rights because that's ethical, and this would lead to a collapse of the system. And actually, it's the same for the human population on Earth. I mean, it's very clear that we have overpopulation relative to the resources of Earth that we should. Of course, we can use technology, find ways, use sustainable classification of agriculture, and so on and so forth. But actually, as such, there are too many of us. Areas in others, there are a population, but you can't can't say that the individual trumps the collective, but then you can't ethically maybe also say that the collective trumps the individual. So how do you come out of that conundrum?
Exactly. Thank you so much, because this is also why I was wondering, maybe we don't talk about ethics because it gets us into a conundrum, because you mentioned at one point the way to get out of this mess might be to question how and to whom is what important, and that directly shows we cannot escape the hierarchy. We cannot escape anthropocentrism just by calling it rights of nature, as Ms. Schweitzer has said. And also, Frank Adloff, you have also mentioned at one point the distinction between sentient and non-sentient, between rights of an individual pig and an individual snail. So as soon as we talk about ethics, we get into trouble.
There's just another comment. I think you have to get really close to the microphone.
Okay. so yeah, I saw that there's this little red light. As soon as you see the small red light, then you know you're being transferred to the online participants.
Thank you for this question. I think I could also add something to that. I was referring a little bit to these questions of ethics, and my observation is that we find two different strands of thinking over the last 40, 50 years. It's kind of biocentric ethics, like deep ecology or the land ethic and so on, is really focusing on collectives, on mountains, forests and so on. But it has become, in a way, defensive in the realm of moral thinking, moral philosophy. Consensus, more or less, is that this kind of ethical thinking is defeated. It is not tenable, that it is not a real argument that you can make, that there's an intrinsic ethical value in a forest. That is the state of the art, so to speak, in ethics, in my observation. So what is stronger there is moral individualism, like animal ethics, to prove that they are sentient beings like the pigs, feel similar to humans. And then they make the argument that we could go in this direction of animal rights. And I think is still lacking is a kind of connection between ways of thinking, kind of dialogue or complementarity between individual and collective rights. And my situation as a sociologist, I'm not a moral philosopher. I'm not so much interested in the question of, can I give good reasons for believing in collective values? Philosophical question. My question is, what do people think of nature in quotation marks, and what is their kind of everyday ethics? And I believe that it is not only a kind of ethical attitude toward individuals, also towards nature as an entity. And we have to make sense out of that. Why do people feel something like respect, reference to something wider like nature in a bigger way? And we have to take that seriously. Then the next step would be, let's use the law as an instrument. We don't have to think so much about justification issues in a moral philosophy sense. Just use instruments, and then we will see, that is my prognosis, that this kind of, for example, ecological entity is in correspondence with the everyday intuitions many people have. We have the impression that there is something like a you, nature, as something which is not only an object, but something you can address with maybe also like a spiritual transcendence also. And the natural form of law is open to various ethical ways of thinking. Would be my.
Thank you. Also, thank you for bringing up the productivity of the nature construct again. I also agree with you that perhaps having nature as a subject that you can address, even though it might be generalizing, even though there is a danger of intensifying human nature dichotomies once again, still from a philosophical or from a socio-cultural perspective, perhaps it is valuable in terms of being one of the small steps towards changing our thinking. Also move to another question now.
Yeah, maybe we can. Oh, you want to add something to that? Yeah.
I don't have the scientific tools to give you a positive ethic. This or that way. But I was wondering, when you asked the question whether it's too easy to say there's dichotomy between individual rights and collective rights. Because if we look closely at the law, then we see there are collective rights. So the third generation of human know the concept, and we do know the rights of collectives. Those certain rights of collectives would serve. We don't have this dichotomy, so we might have more tools within law in order to use it.
Maybe a round of questions. Was on the list itself, but Leggevi first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these perfect presentations we had today. My question relates to the ethical question we just had. I think it depends very much how we construct the relation between nature and people. Okay, so there is this hierarchical model we want to overcome. There is this notion of intrinsic value of things, etc. It's the intrinsic value, a value as such, and this is a different answer to the ethical question. If there is intrinsic value of nature, of species, of collectives, then we have to discuss it otherwise, because it's not depending on the kind of ethics we are used to in modernity since 300 years. And there is an intrinsic value of nature, then it's not depending on the intervention of mankind. You mentioned, Frank, the notion of relational. You preferred the notion of relational. And then there is the human nature connection is established in a different way. It's relational, as you say. I think this depends very much how we answer the question. I belong to those who, at least at the thought experiment, would like to push as far as possible the notion of intrinsic values. Before we understand this, that nature or parts of nature, a particular aspect, have an intrinsic value as such, we cannot really decide the way we relate or we construct hierarchies or the way we still are into the framework of anthropocentrism, which we obviously cannot leave in this. Thank you.
We have one more comment. I'm very sorry for this. That some couldn't, that the online participants couldn't hear you. So maybe you will really have to get close and look at this red light that you can see in front of you. Answer. Who wants to pick up this question?
Klaus, actually, I would agree. The argument I tried to make with regard to the relational values was that place kind of misunderstanding to think that indigenous people like people in Ecuador or the Iwi in New Zealand would claim, for example, the river in New Zealand. I think it would be a misunderstanding to say that the interest of those indigenous people was to claim that every river has the right to become a legal person and to be valued in itself. That would be a kind of done rereading of their aims. Their aim was, we live there and we have this close relationship. And we normally don't have a clear understanding what that means because we think in the dichotomy of intrinsic value or instrumental value, and it does not fit into this dichotomy. In the end, I would say I'm, in a way, a supporter of the way of intrinsic values, but as an interim solution, we should more address the relational values because it can be an instrument many people understand quite well, and it can be used, instrumentally used, to further our political and juridical aims. That's all.
Then I have myself on the list, and the first question is straightforward, maybe to Franziska, Albrecht. Does it work? So the approaches out there in New Zealand are now in place for a few years, and maybe elsewhere in the world. So, do you think? What is your impression? Is there even any analysis? Does it work? Yes or no? And what are the effects?
To get as close to the microphone as possible. Well, as always with legal questions, it depends. I'm sorry, that's a typical lawyer answer. Does it work? Yes, in some contexts, in some legal systems, it does work. It is a process of experimentation, and it's a sort of 2 steps forwards, 1 step backwards thing. Sometimes it's also 1 step forwards, 2 steps backwards. For example, I mentioned the Los Cedros case. The court case worked very well. It was a good court case, procedurally speaking. Different interest groups were heard. The court took a lot of time and effort to deliberate. The decision was passed in favor of the rights of nature, but there are implementation issues. So it's not perfect, but as always with the law, when we have changes in the law, it takes some time and it takes a lot of adjustments until we find a workable solution. And the law is never perfect. So I would say it's a step in the right direction, and there are promising examples, and we have to just keep trying.
Just to follow up, a brief one. What are the implementation issues? That?
Well, it depends on what level you're looking at. For example, if you have a constitution, it's not sufficient that the constitution of a country says we have rights of nature. You also need laws that are at a lower level than the constitution to implement those provisions of the constitutions. If you don't have those laws, it doesn't work. If you just have a provision in the constitution saying we have rights of nature, but you don't change anything else about the legal system, then everybody who has issues with how certain decisions are being taken has to go all the way up to the Constitutional Court to argue that there has been a violation of rights of nature.
May I also pose a question? The Aarhus Convention really... Sorry.
One contribution by...
You were just mentioning what is going on.
Go ahead.
So that was Aarhus Convention you mentioned. How is that working?
Also with the Aarhus Convention, it is a process that takes time. I would say it has brought a lot of improvements, especially because the European Union is itself a party to the Aarhus Convention, which means that for all member states of the European Union, also with the Aarhus Convention, it is a process that takes time. I would say it has brought a lot of improvements, especially because the European Union is itself a party to the Aarhus Convention, which means that for all member states of the European Union, the Aarhus Convention is a part of European law that they have to implement. So that is a very strong sort of directive that the Aarhus Convention now addresses to the member states of the European Union. But as we see in Germany, implementation is not perfect. We have in Germany the Environmental Appeals Act, which has already been reviewed, I think, 3 or 4 times, and there's another change coming next year, probably, hopefully. And they are doing this incrementally. They are doing incremental changes. So there's a lot of room for improvement. It is a good legal tool, the Aarhus Convention, but there's also a lot of pushback, and we are currently seeing that in the German legal system, that political parties, some of the ministries are actually trying to roll back the protections of the Aarhus Convention, unfortunately.
I just want to pick up the question we asked before and what Adloff answered. Because the case of EV is interesting. I'm not an expert for the way the EVs don't know. I read a lot about it, but in fact, I don't know. So, but when you look at the discussions which were before the bill, the EV said that the right which would be the most closely to what they want, property. And the Crown said, oh no, water which is moving, we can't assign property to. They made a dogmatic argument, and then they chose the way to go for the rights of nature. And that means that the EV don't have the sovereignty. They didn't want to have rights of nature in the sense of every river has to be assigned with the rights of nature. There were certain problems, colonial problems, which has to be solved in trying to connect 2 different legal thinking. And so it might be that the rights of nature are not the solution for everything. First thing, and the second thing is with the intrinsic value of nature, it's that talk just makes up the problem. What is nature? We know what nature is. So, coming from a legal point of view, I would say Article 1 of the German Constitution. I don't know the English translation. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Can somebody help me? Dignity of humankind is untouchable. Nobody knows what the word indignity is. You have to process it. From a always have to process it. You always have to see how it is working. And then you can say what it is. You can't say it in advance. So we might use nature or the intrinsic value of nature as something which we state, but we can't define. And say, okay, we have something which is sort of we have to deal with, but we can't define. And then we do have a relational thinking without assigning or giving a definition, because then we do have unsolutionable problems.
And I would agree, because it's also like you just brought up, we can have a law. Oh, am I enough? We can have a law. We can have paragraphs in the Constitution about the value of nature broadly, but how do we implement these things? And that sounds like a pattern, actually, in what you're saying, that there's systematically an implementation problem. And this is most likely linked to the problem of definition or even separation of units of nature and everything else. So how do we do this in practice? Maybe that's part of what should go into not only this level of agreeing that nature or the environment are important, but also there's a huge discussion, I guess, to be had about how do we do it in practice? How do we get these laws or these implementation guidelines to be practicable? And also, there's always going to be a lobbying. There's always going to be a conflict there, no matter what you do, no matter how you look at it. There are always going to be different interests. And as I was saying, not only between the people and nature, but also between different compartments or aspects of these species. Those kinds of decisions, and it's also related to this previous question as well, I don't have, like, how do we design a priority ranking or something like that? Tricky.
Okay. Maybe I shortly introduce myself since I'm a guest here. I'm not coming from the field of studying issues of nature, but more issues of governance, civil society, etc. And thereby the allusion of my comment or question, we'll see, is more with the broad issue of rights. I mean, this broad issue, I mean, maybe I can use it as a picture. If we speak of human rights or the rights of the human species, we have a broad field that reaches from detailed legislation on state or even community level over to the question of human rights worldwide. And if you use this as a background, questions I had which came up was about at which level of securing rights of nature are we speaking about? And obviously then everybody will say, well, they're of different levels, and we know the glory and the misery, for instance, of the Declaration of Human Rights, the glory and the misery. We know the importance of cutting it down to rights of citizens, where human rights might be concrete, etc. So my first idea was how could we use this, looking at the history of rights taking shape as human rights historically on different levels, and use it a bit for our imagination, how rights of nature stepwise and interrelated on different levels could take shape. So that was what went in my head, could be helpful for the future. But to give it a little bit more, how to say, pepper, I thought about something when it was about individual rights and the common good, I thought about an important institution in between of human rights, one extreme, and detailed programming of everyday work of governments, which is a totally different field, a field which is common sense, and that field is money. And I thought about the institution we have created with the International Monetary Fund. It's an institution which on the one hand has a kind of special legal basis, but it's a kind of bit of a hybrid because in a selected field, it can make interventions. So it's not just a legal framework, it's not just a convention, but it's not a full political actor, but it's halfway both. And I found it interesting, and I think for the future, for this topic, thinking about the different levels of institutionalized politics, lawmaking, law claiming, etc. Between these two extremes I had with human rights and, detailed rights as you have as a citizen might be helpful and interesting when we speak about rights to nature.
Comments on this one?
This inspires you.
Well, we do have them on all levels. We do have the draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Nations, the 2010, and we do have it on the community level. In the United States, we do have ordinances. Local communities, highly strategically, especially in order to avoid fracking. So we do have it on all levels, and it's good. And I'm trying to figure out how they intervene, what is referred to. We do have this huge question on indigenous worldviews, ignoring that we do have a tradition to talk about it without indigenous worldviews and coming up with the same results. We don't need that, in fact. So what is happening here? So NGOs, we have local NGOs, we have international. And for me, it's also interesting what is by of nature. Like the example with the EV. I turn not to the best for some.
Claudia.
I think I'm going to have to move. Claudia Ford, and I'm a fellow of the panel for Planetary Thinking, and thank you for these very interesting presentations and comments. I'm not sure if this is a question, because if it is, it's a difficult question to answer, so I apologize for that. But what really fascinates me about this discussion is this tension that we have, the challenge that we need to get over of using one framework, of one paradigm of thinking, one epistemology to understand another when we're talking about the rights of nature and indigenous worldviews. So, and I think most of the speakers have pointed that out. For example, even the idea that the law is neutral, which is something that most of us in Western thought take for granted, but the law is not neutral. It's based on a very, very specific ethical framework. And this comment that in the New Zealand case, in the end, what happened is that the rights were granted to the relationship between the river and the Maori and not to the river itself. And I would argue that there is no such difference in an indigenous worldview. You can't make a dichotomy. The relationship between the people in the river and the river that you can't distinguish. But in law, you can. So I just point that out as something that, for me, we need to constantly be aware of, that we're using one framework to talk about another, and they are not easily bridged in that way. And I guess the question to all of us is, how can we be aware of that, and what can we do to address that challenge? Because it is an important part of establishing certainly intrinsic value that we as humans have for the natural world.
I totally agree. The thing is, what my point of view we can see referring to the indigenous concepts in the way we do with our epistemic framework, sort of we only pick one thing. We don't take their worldview. We only pick one thing, and we instrumentalize it. And that's not the post-colonial problem. It's not. Or it's not it shouldn't be that way. So these are the things which I'm interested in. What's happening here? So.
I agree with that, and I work for work with an organization that is attempting to bridge this. So, for example, I'm on the board of a farm organization, and the land has intrinsic rights set in our constitution, and so as a board member, the land does not vote when I'm voting, but every year we have a process, a representational and ceremonial process by which we take the decision-making value of the land seriously. So what we're trying to do there is bridge an indigenous, what you might call an indigenous worldview about relationship to our farmland and our Western constructs about how do you run an organization, how do you run a board. And it works quite well for us because we're giving, in this case, giving equal respect to these two different ways of making decisions. Not trying to say that they can be integrated or understood in the same way, but just that they are both valid ways of approaching how we make decisions about how we use the land.
Yeah, thank you. I find that a very, very important point. And that refers also to things you mentioned in your talk about, for example, when we stop our agriculture, that could be result in a loss of biodiversity. So what we see here, nature is not something which is clearly separable from human interference, from human beings. And if we go into this direction, that would mean that we really have to think of giving rights to relationships, as you mentioned. And maybe the term I was proposing in my talk, conviviality, helps here. It is forms of conviviality, of conviviality, living together that need to be protected. And we have to distinguish forms of conviviality, a good relationship between people and their land, people and nature, from relationships of unconviviality, of exploiting nature and so on. So really, I think it would be a good move to think of the connection between land or nature and people. And maybe conviviality, rights of conviviality is something that would help us to prevent the danger of a new kind of split between nature, rights of nature on the one hand, and human rights on the other hand.
It just legal discussions here talk about this, what you described, sort of procedural justice. Not the question of does the nature have the right or not. It's focuses on the procedures. This might be one thing. We shouldn't talk about the anthropocentrism all the time. Probably we might look at the procedures, how it works, and we can learn from that and not from worldview, which in fact I have problems to understand. Since I'm Eurocentristic, sure, I'm grown up here, I grew up with my thinking, I will have problems.
Just want to invite our digital participants, whether there are any questions. I think I can't see any chat, so if you have any questions, you can post them chat, or you can raise your hand and Lisa?
So if there are no questions in the chat, or if people are still gathering their thoughts, I'd ask another one, if I may. Because coming back to the question of looking at the procedures, my question would go to Franziska Albrecht again, because I'm really intrigued by this idea of spokespersons for safeguarding environmental rights or non-human rights. So I was wondering whether in your practice you have come across the idea of, in order to represent the rights or the interests or the conviviality or the health of a population of animals in particular, because I've read the work by Eva Meyer on interspecies democracy. I'm not sure whether you've heard of it. And she really takes a strong claim for, in order to formulate these, in order to get to know what we are supposed to advocate, people really need to go closely to the habitats of the animals, go closely to the communities between and to the spaces where humans and animals and ecosystems actually interact, observe closely, and then learn from that. And then, of course, we get to the question and to the conundrum of money. How do you actually implement that? How do you finance this? Are these mostly individualized and just small instances where you can see these things happening, and do these things happen effectively? And do you think it's profitable or even practical to try implement this on a larger scale?
As for concrete examples from the European legal context, to the best of my knowledge, the law granting rights to the Mar Menor is the first that even addresses that issue, and they have a fairly complicated but well thought out system of representation with 3 different bodies that perform different tasks, and they are constituted of various members and interest groups. I absolutely agree with you. You cannot be a good guardian if you don't understand your ward. I mean, if you have guardianship for a child, then you should have the child's best interests in mind. And to do that, you have to know the child. And you have to ideally know something about the needs of children. And the same would be true if you were the guardian for a forest or for a group of animals. There are different practical ways of implementing guardianships. It could be a state, a government body, for example. It could be a sort of council that is either voted in for a set term, or it's constituted on the basis of need. It could be NGOs. It could be various actors that come together and form a guardianship council. So that is possible. As for the money, I mean, if we want it, we will find the money for it. That's always the issue in politics. It is absolutely necessary to look at the costs, because, for example, court cases can get fairly expensive, especially if you lose. That's one issue that we currently face with NGOs fighting for nature. For some NGOs, especially the smaller ones, they can't actually go to court in certain cases because they don't have the money, because they rely on public goodwill for their funding. So that's an issue that would need to be addressed, but it's possible to do that.
I was wondering, Claudia, you mentioned that in New Zealand, rights were given not to the forest or to the river. I mean, there are several of these cases in New Zealand, but to the relation between forest. And I was wondering, is it the same with the Laguna? Who is it focused on? Is it focused on the relation, or is it focused on the rights of the Laguna itself? I think that there might be this might result in quite some differences in terms of whether you need people who act as guardians represent the will, and how is this will of the laguna or the forest really envisioned, measured, evaluated, however you may put this, or if you focus really on the relation between the both. So maybe whoever, Claudia, has more insight than this, or Franziska, Albrecht, to learn about this.
Well, I have to caution you. I mean, I've only read this law and only in the English translation. I have not had any part in actually writing it or anything. But from what I have read, it is not primarily focused on the relationship. It actually grants, it says, legal personality to the Mar Menor and its basin shall be granted, being henceforth formally recognized as a subject of law. So that's the first article. It does, however, in its preamble mention the socio-environmental, ecological and humanitarian crisis affecting the Mar Menor. So it is not completely blind to the socio-environmental context. And the fact that the sort of guardianship bodies include local municipalities and local interest groups also speaks to that it recognizes that there is a relationship aspect to this problem.
And I was referring to the comment from the previous talk about the Wanganui River, and I don't have expertise in either of those cases. What I do have familiarity with is indigenous communities and the way that they are trying to negotiate these relationships, kind of what their perspective is, how it happens, how you sit at council, sit in circle, do divination, do ritual, and what happens in those spaces to give agency to what we would consider parts of nature, right? Like a river or a forest or a species. And what guardianship consists of, which I think someone has already mentioned. It's very much about being there, knowing, for example, if you're the guardian of a river, knowing that river, living with that river, if you're the guardian of a species, actually being able to observe and be what we consider an expert, but it's a different type of expertise. It's a lived expertise. And that confers the rights of guardianship in these cases.
The research field for a political scientist who works in a comparative manner. I think.
May I just add? But
yeah, sure.
But we have the natural protection rights, the former ones, which are guaranteed by the state, and we don't ask the state how he does know it. Why do we have to ask now the rights of nature? I don't think the problem changes in any way. So it's not an argument against it. It's often brought up as an argument against it, but shouldn't. Before it was not the same way.
I was told a question in the chat.
Yes, we do. So the question would be, how do environmental NGOs believe it is possible to know exactly that natures have been violated? How does social constructionism get addressed in these narratives? Or to rephrase it, does this emerging jurisprudence on rights of nature point to a decline in environmentalist belief in specific human guardianship?
Feels competent for answering that. Also here on the screen, the question.
I would like to answer to the first part. How do environmental NGOs know exactly that the rights are being violated? They don't. But it's the same if you are the legal guardian of a person who cannot speak for themselves, for example, because they are in a coma. How do you know exactly that they feel that their rights are being violated? You don't. You work with the best approximation of what you know about them and about their rights. And then you try to go from there. And it's the same way you briefly mentioned that. How does the state know that the legal protections for nature are being violated? Well, it looks at the problem, at what is happening, and it looks at the current laws that are in force, and then it, or in most cases rather the courts try to determine whether there's a violation of law or not. And if we are talking law, we are always talking the laws that exist. So if you go to court claiming a violation of the rights of nature, then you can only claim a violation of the rights that are granted and the protections that are already laid down in the law.
Yeah, following up to this, I have a question for you, Emily. In my understanding, there was a kind of a cooperation between ecologists, biologists, and economists with respective to ecosystem services. When did that begin? How did that start? What is your experience with that? And would it be a good idea to be as an intimate person, having real knowledge about ecosystems, how they function, and so to work together with lawyers? So how about starting a new cooperation, not so much with lawyers, with economists, but lawyers or sociologists?
Thank you. A very good point and question. I'm not the expert on this collaboration between economists and ecologists. And for that, I would address you to Thomas Koellner, who's in Bayreuth currently and could be a good participant in this panel at some point. So I can't tell you exactly when this started and so on, but I think that maybe conceptually we can say that the idea of value in nature with economic terms maybe started with Gretchen Daly's book, Nature's Services. And I think I can't remember the date exactly, so it's been a while, but this introduction of the term ecosystem services is basically how this a means to a monetary value on things. And that's how this collaboration with the economists started. And I would fully agree with you. We need this collaboration between ecologists and legal experts and lawyers. Because I mean, this whole discussion, I was thinking the whole time, well, okay, well, as ecologists, we have a lot of work to do if we really want to know what's going on in these ecosystems. So we're speaking of guardianship, and we're speaking of knowing these systems to such an extent that we know what may be going wrong with them and what needs to be adjusted. As an ecologist, at least at this point where I am, I would not be able to say whether this is a violation of the system's rights. I have no idea whether these entities in the system may have rights at this time, but I would be able to say, if I know the system well, whether, for example, a certain species is being further threatened by different management practices, for instance, and something like that. I can only know that with a lot of money in the end, with a detailed study and understanding of that. So yes, there needs to be, I think, such a direct collaboration, because as ecologists, we can't be the guardians as such, because we don't have this legal knowledge, expertise, or point of view. I mean, we would have to be at least two people in one. At the same time, I don't know if the lawyers can be the guardians by themselves, because you also need to know what's going on dynamically in that system. You need to be involved with it constantly. So yes, I think that would be a very good thing to have such a collaboration, absolutely. And then there's the tricky issue of scale, again, as we discussed, because it's all very good to think theoretically of this guardianship of a certain ecosystem, but where does that ecosystem start and where does it end? In some cases, maybe you can define that they're like nature protection areas, where you might say that there's expertise of what species are there and how they are dynamically evolving or changing according to different processes. But that more or less always, I would say, has some kind of large-scale impact or implication. So how do you deal with that? If I'm the guardian of a certain protected area or a certain system, maybe I can say, well, this management practice is not good. There's too much logging. The species are dying. But then what if it's the climate impact? What if it's a whole completely different process happening at a completely different scale with different responsibilities? I mean, we've touched on this fact that the Earth as a system is actually really important in that sense, but how do we deal with it legally? And there are other issues, even smaller, I guess, than the Earth as a system is telecoupling, because you have exports, you have imports of, well, of course, materials in economy, but you also have exports and imports of species, processes. So I think that there would be a lot of work to do indeed with such a legal collaboration. It could be very productive.
Thank you. We have, you want to say something?
I'd like to briefly add that I absolutely agree. And from the legal point of perspective, we have a similar problem because most legal experts do not have the scientific background they need to understand ecological relationships and problems. I'm familiar with this because I'm writing my dissertation on protection of biodiversity, and I spent about 2 years just researching the scientific background to be even able to write this dissertation, because that's not something that comes up when you study law. So I absolutely agree, we need a collaboration.
We have one, and I would say last question in the chat. Are there also more questions or comments here in the room? Or then we go with chat.
The question is about different reasons why there should be rights of nature, but they often come from a need of humanity. And the question is, does it conclude from the human rights that in a way human dignity is violated when the nature or the relationship to nature is not treated with respect? Or otherwise, how do we reason for rights of nature? Is it from our dependency, like ecosystem services of nature, or is it rather from a perspective of respect and acknowledgement that nature is bigger than us, humanity, and we should respect it as much, at minimum, as we respect each other as humans? And for this, there was also like an answer in the chat which stated perhaps the Australian law emerged from the contestation between humans over the lack of respect for one set of humans in the first place. So in this case, sorry.
Wants to add to this question something?
I would like to ask a different question, or a question in response to that. Why do we need to choose? Why can't we have various reasons for wanting rights of nature? An economic reason, because it's obviously we are dependent on certain ecosystem services, on pollination, for example. But we also, I mean, most people agree that there is an intrinsic value to nature, and people have an inborn love for, or at least interest in nature. You see this with very small children. So why can't we have various reasons for wanting to have rights of nature?
There is the tradition to address the problem in the terms of human rights as well. For example, the right to have access to clean water and rights. So we do have the way to go with human rights, or we can go with rights of nature. But if we go with rights of nature, I think we address that human rights might have some problems as well, that there are legal pluralism in the world. There are not only the continental and common law tradition, there are lots of legal orders, lots of different ways how to address problems. And as we have seen with our continental law tradition, we didn't get a solution, so we might look how we can find something.
Coming to an end, I think this panel has shown very much that this is really an explorative avenue we have to go, thinking, practicing, researching about the rights of nature. One last question to all of you. If you and we've seen many open ends in this discussion. If you were given, let's say, €1 million research grant, what would be the core question you would pose to bring this topic to more clarification? 10 minutes.
I think we need that.
I would think half a year about it, the question.
Very spontaneously, I would use it for a European value to research the question, which values do people attribute to research?
And I would use to look what is happening within law as well besides that. As we are talking about our problems with the material world, but we do have developments as, for example, intellectual property right, immaterial world, and how this intertwines. Because we are focusing on one part of the world, and it might be that there's happening something aside which is very much influencing it.
I believe I would try to figure out how can we continue this process that we have started with the Aarhus Convention of public participation and also access to justice in environmental matters, and how can civil society be an actor that strives for environmental protection, and how can we sort of develop this idea as civil society, not only NGOs, but also other organizational forms, and maybe even individuals as guardians and defenders of the rights of nature.
There's already a lot to be done with these euros or dollars. Well, I have another idea, and I think it would be complementary, obviously. I think that one thing that we might not have talked about so much is I think that I would start to look at the bottlenecks or the implementation barriers that might be preventing this. Because I think if you talk to people on an individual level, everybody agrees that something needs to be done. But there's always some reason, some argument that prevents it from actually being done. And I think I would research that, and I would figure out what measures need to be taken to remove those roadblocks. Perfect. Great, you're doing that.
Thank you so much. I think there is an agreement that this discussion has to move to maybe a bit more empirical grounds and to get more insights. I've just have one or two more organizational issues. The first one, I think we learned that we maybe have to invite, if we have a follow-up discussion, maybe an indigenous scholar. Thank you so much for coming to Gießen and talking to us about the rights of nature. Thank you.